I walked into the family court in downtown Chicago, knowing that everyone in that room had already decided how my story would end. They thought I was reckless, some thought I was desperate, a few probably thought I'd finally lost my mind. My name is Amelia Morgan, and that morning I was representing myself in a divorce proceeding against my ex-husband, James Harrington. James wasn't just my ex. He was the CEO of the Northern Logistics Group, a shipping firm everyone in the city knew. He had powerful friends, endless money, and a legal team that seemed built to crush people quietly and efficiently. I had none of that. No lawyer sitting beside me, no briefcase full of color-coded binders, no assistant whispering and passing notes behind me. Just me, a notepad, and a calm I had practiced for months. As I sat down, I could feel the judgment in the air, the discreet glances, the unspoken agreement that this would be over quickly. They expected tears. They expected me to sign whatever was put in front of me and disappear back into the life I came from. James, of course, expected it. He didn't even try to hide his confidence. He leaned back in his chair, perfectly relaxed, as if this were a meeting where he already knew the outcome. He looked at me the way someone looks at a closed chapter, finished, forgotten. What no one in that courtroom understood was this. I didn't walk in unprepared. I walked in knowing exactly where every secret was kept. For years, I listened when people thought I wasn't paying attention. I watched patterns they assumed I was too simple to notice. I learned to be silent when speaking would have been dangerous. And now, standing in that court, I was done being quiet. This wasn't the day I lost everything. This was the day the truth finally walked into the room with me. To understand why everyone underestimated me, you have to understand the version of Amelia Morgan they believed in. In their minds, I was simple, predictable, easy to dismiss. Before James Harrington came into my life, I worked long shifts at a small neighborhood diner. I memorized orders, smiled through exhaustion. I counted tips at the end of the night and hoped they'd cover the essentials. When James and I got married, that history disappeared. I became his wife, not his partner, not his equal, just the woman who stayed home and made his life easier. I managed the house, the schedules, the social obligations that made him look polished and respectable. I remembered birthdays, organized charity dinners, and smiled at people who never learned my first name. To the outside world, that looked like comfort. What they didn't see was the control. James managed every dollar. I had no access to our accounts. If I needed money, I had to ask for it. If I questioned an expense, I was told not to worry about things I didn't understand. At first, I believed him. He spoke with certainty. Numbers came easily to him. I told myself this was how marriages worked, when one person was successful and the other wasn't. But over time, the boundaries tightened. My phone calls were questioned, my friendships faded, the invitations stopped coming. Somewhere along the way, my world shrank so quietly, I barely noticed it happening. When the divorce began, James made sure that version of me stayed intact. He told people I was emotional, unstable, dependent. His lawyer described me as someone with no financial expertise, someone who would be overwhelmed by complex information, someone who needed to be protected from herself. And the worst part was this: I helped them believe it. I kept my head down, spoke softly. I let them mistake my silence for confusion, because while they were busy defining me by who I used to be, they never once asked who I had become. They never wondered what happens when a woman spends years being ignored. They never considered that the person living inside the system often understands it better than the person who built it. By the time I stood alone in that courtroom, I knew exactly how they saw me, and I knew exactly how wrong they were. James Harrington had mastered the art of looking untouchable. He wore confidence the way some men wear tailored suits, effortlessly, without question. He walked into rooms assuming he belonged, and most of the time, people agreed. As CEO of the Northern Logistics Group, James was known as a ruthless negotiator. He made things happen. He knew how to move money, transfer assets, and make problems disappear before they went public. That reputation followed him into the courthouse. When James sat at the defense table, it was clear he believed this was just another negotiation. He expected to win, so his posture was relaxed, his expression calm, almost bored. Beside him was his lawyer, Victor Hale. Victor wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He had a reputation for precision and pressure. He spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. He was known for forcing settlements without ever raising his voice. Together, they looked like a machine designed for a single purpose: control. James glanced at me once, briefly, the way someone checks the time. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, only dismissal. To him, I was a problem that had dragged on longer than expected. I knew his habits well. I had watched him in meetings, at dinners, at charity events. He listened just long enough to decide if someone mattered. And that morning, he had already decided I didn't. James believed the story he'd built around himself, that success was proof of intelligence, that wealth meant credibility, that the law was just another tool he knew how to use. He assumed my lack of legal representation meant weakness. He assumed silence meant ignorance. What he failed to consider was this: men like James spend their lives talking. They rarely practice listening. And I had spent years doing exactly that. Every late-night call, every rushed explanation, every moment he thought I was too distracted to notice something, I remembered them all. As the judge prepared to begin, James leaned back in his chair, certain the balance of power was firmly on his side. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet was already shifting. While James was busy building his image, I was building something quieter. At night, when the house was finally silent, I would sit at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the lights low. I taught myself to read bank statements, to track transfers, to understand the hidden language inside spreadsheets. I didn't do this because I wanted control. I did it because I wanted clarity. James assumed I had no interest in his work. He spoke freely around me. He took calls at the dinner table. He complained about partners, regulators, and people he considered incompetent. He never lowered his voice. I learned patterns the way other people learn routines. Which accounts were mentioned only in passing? Which transactions appeared at the end of the quarter? Which names came up only when he was stressed? I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions that would raise suspicion. I listened. When he synced his devices to the family cloud account for convenience, I noticed when files appeared in folders I'd never seen before. I noticed that too. I started saving copies, not stealing, not hacking, just backing up what already existed in the shared space. Emails, statements, internal summaries that were never meant to leave his screen. I kept everything simple: dates, amounts, repetitions. No theories, no assumptions, just facts. There were nights I wanted to stop, nights I told myself I was overthinking it, that nothing I found would matter anyway. But then I would remember how easily my access to money had been cut off, how quickly my voice had been dismissed once I became an inconvenience. That's when I understood something important. Preparation isn't about revenge, it's about survival. By the time James filed for divorce, I had months of information organized discreetly. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just a clear map of where the truth lived. So when I walked into that courtroom alone, I wasn't guessing. I was confirming. They thought I came empty-handed because they couldn't see what I was carrying. They didn't realize the quiet woman they ignored had been paying attention the whole time. And attention, when paired with patience, is far more dangerous than anger. The courtroom felt different once the hearing began. At first, everything followed the expected rhythm: formal introductions, polite language, carefully measured confidence from the defense. Victor Hale spoke smoothly, laying out a familiar narrative: a successful executive, a short-term marriage, a reasonable offer extended and rejected. James barely looked at me as Victor spoke. He knew this version of the story by heart. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice steady and my words simple. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I asked questions. I mentioned a fund account that Victor hadn't referenced, an investment entity James had dismissed as insignificant during our marriage. The reaction was immediate. Victor paused for only a second, but it was enough. James shifted in his chair. The judge leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. I didn't explain everything. I didn't reveal documents yet. I simply stated that certain assets had not been declared and that I would be addressing them during testimony. The room went quiet. That silence wasn't confusion. It was recalculation. Victor adjusted his papers. James straightened his posture. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at me. There was no anger in his expression. There was uncertainty. Victor quickly objected, calling my statement speculation. He spoke with confidence, dismissing my words as a misunderstanding. I didn't argue. I just nodded and said I would provide the documentation when appropriate. That's when I felt it. The shift. What had been routine suddenly felt unstable. The energy in the room moved from certainty to caution. James leaned toward Victor and whispered something I couldn't hear. Victor nodded once, his jaw tight. They weren't ignoring me anymore. They were adapting, and that told me everything I needed to know. I hadn't won anything yet, but the illusion of control they walked in with had cracked, and once that happens, it never fully repairs. The judge called the first witness for the defense, and James chose confidence over caution. Daniel Pierce, the CFO of Northern Logistics Group, took the stand with the ease of a man who had testified before. He spoke clearly, smiled politely, and answered questions as if this were nothing more than a formality. Victor guided him carefully. Daniel confirmed that all marital assets had been disclosed, that the company's finances were clean, that no funds had been improperly hidden or diverted. It was a well-rehearsed performance. When it was my turn to question him, I didn't approach the stand right away. I stayed where I was and spoke calmly. I asked Daniel how long he'd worked with James. I asked about standard accounting practices. I asked about internal controls and audit schedules. Simple questions, comfortable questions. Daniel relaxed. Then I asked him about an internal account used for temporarily holding funds before quarterly reporting. He hesitated for just a moment, but the hesitation was there. I asked how often that account was used. I asked if it was listed on the declared assets provided during the discovery process. Daniel cleared his throat. He said it was operational. He said it wasn't relevant to marital assets. I asked if funds were ever moved from that account to other investment entities. The room went still. Victor objected, claiming the question was out of scope. The judge allowed it. Daniel's confidence faded. He explained that some transfers were routine and authorized. He insisted nothing improper had occurred. I thanked him and then asked one last question. I asked if any transfers had been made in the 90 days before James filed for divorce. Daniel looked at James before he answered. That was the moment everything changed. The judge noticed it, Victor noticed it, and James noticed that everyone noticed it. Daniel answered carefully, admitting that several transfers had been made shortly before the filing. I didn't accuse him of any wrongdoing. I simply stated I would be submitting documentation that matched his testimony. Daniel stepped down from the stand, his initial ease replaced by a visible tension. As he walked away, I saw it clearly. This was no longer about a divorce settlement. It was about whether the truth would stay buried. And judging by the way James was avoiding my eyes, I knew it wouldn't. That was when James decided to change tactics. Victor stood and addressed the court with a tone that sounded almost concerned. "This case is becoming emotional," he said. He suggested the court consider my credibility before evaluating complex financial claims. Then he introduced my medical history. He spoke of a period years ago when I sought help for anxiety and grief. He used words like treatment and evaluation. He hinted at instability without saying it directly. James watched me closely, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. I had spent years learning how silence could be manipulated against me. This time, I wouldn't allow it. When it was my turn to respond, I rose slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I stated the truth. I explained that I sought help during a time of loss, that I did what responsible adults do when they feel overwhelmed, that the treatment didn't make me unreliable. It made me honest about my limits. I looked at the judge and said something simple. Seeking help does not disqualify a person from telling the truth. Victor pushed further, suggesting I had imagined threats, that I misinterpreted conversations, that stress had distorted my memory. I listened without interrupting. Then I said the one sentence James didn't expect. I said I was medicated because I was being gaslit. The room shifted again. I explained that confusion doesn't just come from weakness. It often comes from being told repeatedly that your perception is wrong, from having access taken away, from being isolated and corrected until you stop trusting your own judgment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I laid out facts, and then I said this. I'm not asking the court to believe me because I'm hurt. I'm asking the court to believe me because I brought proof. James stopped smiling because for the first time, the story that protected him was falling apart, and he knew exactly what was coming next. I reached into my bag slowly, making sure every movement was deliberate. I didn't want this moment to feel dramatic. I wanted it to feel undeniable. I explained that Illinois law allows for one-party consent recordings, that I was legally permitted to record conversations I was a part of, that I had done so not out of spite, but out of fear. Victor objected immediately. He questioned relevance. He questioned intent. The judge allowed it. I held up a small audio device. Nothing impressive, no labels, just a record of time. I told the court these recordings captured conversations between James and me during the last years of our marriage. Conversations where money was discussed, where control was discussed, where the consequences were spelled out, very clearly. The first recording played. James's voice filled the quiet room, confident, dismissive. He said, "No one would ever believe you." He said, "You don't understand finance." He said, "If you push too hard, you'll lose access to everything." There was no yelling, no threats delivered in anger. That's what made it worse. It was control spoken like a fact. The second recording played. James explained how assets could be moved temporarily, how nothing needed to look permanent, how timing mattered more than truth. Victor stared at the table. James stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. By the time the third recording finished, the room was completely silent. No whispers, no movement. Even the judge had stopped writing. I turned off the device and sat back down. I didn't look at James. I didn't have to. Because power doesn't disappear loudly. It disappears when everyone hears it, spoken aloud for the first time. And in that moment, James Harrington was no longer in control of the room. The truth is, after the recordings ended, nothing moved for several seconds. The judge looked at the evidence, then at James, then back at me. This was no longer about who felt wronged, it was about accountability. Victor requested a short recess. His voice was controlled, but the certainty he had walked in with was gone. The court denied the request and ordered the hearing to continue. The judge asked direct questions about timelines, about asset declaration, about whether all holdings tied to the Northern Logistics Group had been properly reported. James answered carefully at first. Short answers, limited explanations. Then the questions got more specific. The answers got slower. The court ordered a temporary review of the financial disclosures and requested immediate documentation related to the transfers mentioned during testimony. Accounts were flagged, access restricted. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No shouting, no raised voices, just procedure. And procedure is often scarier than confrontation. James finally looked back at me, not with anger, not with confidence, but with disbelief. He had believed this room would protect him, that his standing would outweigh my words, that money would speak louder than truth. But once facts enter the record, beliefs no longer matter. The judge made it clear a deeper investigation would follow, that incomplete disclosures carry consequences, that credibility had shifted sides. When the day's session ended, James didn't get up right away. Victor leaned over, speaking to him in a low voice. The tone was no longer instructional. It was urgent. As I gathered my papers, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, but relief. Because for the first time since the divorce began, I was no longer defending myself. The truth was doing that work for me. When the judge asked me what I was seeking, the room expected a number. They expected me to name a percentage, half the assets, a settlement, something that could be negotiated and whittled down. That was never my goal. I stood and explained that I wasn't asking for punishment. I was asking for balance. I told the court that money used to hide the truth isn't wealth. It's an unfair advantage. And an advantage only works when no one is willing to challenge it. I asked for full transparency, that every account tied to James Harrington be audited, that any assets moved without disclosure be considered part of the marital estate. I asked for temporary control of shared assets until the review was complete, not to take anything, but to prevent anything more from disappearing. The judge listened carefully. I explained that I didn't want to win by watching someone fall. I wanted to walk away knowing the truth had been acknowledged and that no one else would be silently erased the way I had been. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ending the pattern. I told the court that when one person controls the narrative for long enough, they begin to believe it can't be challenged. And that belief is dangerous. What I asked for was simple. For the law to do what it was designed to do, to check power, to examine facts, and to protect the person who was never meant to be heard. When I sat back down, the room was quiet again, not tense, but focused. By then I felt something settle in my chest. I had said everything I needed to say. The rest was no longer up to me. When I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, the city looked the same. Cars moved, people hurried past. Life went on as if nothing momentous had just happened inside those walls. But for me, everything had changed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel powerful. What I felt was lighter. For months, my life had revolved around defending my reality, proving I wasn't imagining things, explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds. That weight was gone. The legal process didn't end that day. Investigations take time, paperwork drags on, consequences unfold slowly. But something far more important had already happened. My voice had entered the official record. I moved back into a smaller apartment. I bought my own groceries. I opened a checking account in my own name for the first time in years. None of it was glamorous, but every choice was mine. I was learning again, to trust my instincts, to sit with silence without fear, to make plans that didn't depend on someone else's permission. People asked if it was hard to start over. The truth is, starting over was easier than staying invisible. What took time was forgiving myself for how long I stayed quiet. I wasn't weak for surviving. I was strong for preparing. And as the days passed, I realized something quietly powerful. I was no longer defined by the marriage I escaped. I was defined by the clarity I earned. People often say that power is loud. They imagine it as shouting, as dominance, as someone who always speaks first and last. That's not the kind of power that changed my life. The power that mattered was quieter. It was patience. It was observation. It was choosing to understand instead of react. It was knowing when to be silent and when to finally speak. James Harrington believed strength meant control. He believed money could replace accountability. He believed the story he told about me would survive forever if he just repeated it often enough. He was wrong. Not because I fought harder than him, but because I prepared longer. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Never assume the quiet person knows nothing. Never mistake compliance for agreement. And never believe the truth disappears just because it's ignored. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a thunderclap. Sometimes it arrives with records, with patience, with the courage to wait for the right moment. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been underestimated or made to feel invisible, you are not alone. Your clarity matters, your memory matters, and your voice matters, even if it takes time to be heard. If you found value in this story, please like the video. It helps more people find stories like this. Share it with someone who might need the reminder and tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged for being a quiet person? Subscribe to Revenge with Elena for more true stories about truth, resilience, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply refusing to disappear.